So this week we're going to focus on events that lead up to the Civil War. So it's titled The House Divided. And this is going to be especially important because this will be the topic of your final essay. So make sure you pay attention to this and save this one for future. So last week we talked about the Mexican-American War. In particular, one of the things we pointed out was the fact that they were very divided. Congress was over the whole issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery. And one of the things that comes out of that is a Wilmot Proviso that narrowly passes through the House and the Senate. And essentially it was the idea that slavery would not be permitted in any territory that we gained over Mexico. And it states here, provided that as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to the use by the executive of the moneys herein appropriated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the said territory. So the fact that this almost passes should tell you how divided the country really was at the time, okay? And the real thought behind it was that Mexico at that time had already outlawed slavery, so there was really no need to add new slave states to the Union. And as you know, it was all about a balance of power. So one of the things that happens is that the Free Soil Party emerges out of the Wilmot Proviso. This was really popular in the North in particular. Really, they believed that Congress had no power to abolish slavery itself, but they did believe in the possibility of abolishing it as it spread. And they also believed that slavery itself would undermine the whole idea of free labor market. I'm not talking about free labor as in slavery. I'm talking about as people moved there, if people worked on farms and things like this, there would be no way that they would be able to compete with slavery when they can get labor for free, whereas people that wanted to have a job couldn't work there for a particular wage. And so the other thing they also suggest is this idea of homesteading, right? So that giving free land to people to encourage them to move out west. Now, interestingly, they will pass a Homestead Act in 1862 after the South had seceded from the Union. Okay, so the election of 1848, Polk himself decides not to run. Zachary Taylor was nominated as a Whig, as the Whig candidate. He was a Mexican-American war hero. And the Free Soilers nominate Van Buren. Taylor wins, however, the Whig, but the Free Soilers don't win, but it's important to note that they do get 10% of the popular vote, which should at least tell you that there was the idea, this was a growing movement, this idea of stopping the expansion of slavery from growing. Okay, so we can definitely see that from the election. And here's an electoral map to take a look, and you can see, where they were leading. And you can also note that politics wasn't necessarily regionally divided yet. It will. By 1860, we will definitely see that. But at this time, you can see that it's pretty spread out, the Whigs and the Democrats. Okay, so the next thing, and this is really important, is the Compromise of 1850. So last time we talked about the California Gold Rush and how that had an effect on the population and people moving out west. So pretty quickly, California is going to petition for statehood. But they petition for statehood wanting to come in as a free state. Obviously, this is going to cause conflict. Remember back to the Compromise of 1820, this is going to be an issue. Okay, but Henry Clay, the great compromiser, swoops in yet again and comes up with the idea of the Great Compromise of 1850. This is what it stipulated. Number one, California can enter as a free state as they wanted. Slave trade in D.C., not slavery itself, but the slave trade in D.C., in the nation's capital, would be abolished. A new, tougher fugitive slave law, which we'll talk about in more detail here in just a moment, and the status of slavery in future states in the Mexican territory, not talking about Louisiana territory, the new Mexican territory from the Mexican cession, that would be decided by something called popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty essentially means that the people will decide when they get there, when they apply for statehood, whether or not they would be a slave state or free state. Sounds like a great idea. Not going to work out very well. let's move on here a little bit. So there were definitely differing views to the compromise itself. We had people like Daniel Webster who said, no way, or let's, much on board with Henry Clay, let's accept this. We have to accept this fugitive slave law in order to have a compromise. But then you've got John C. Calhoun that says that there should be no limit on slavery whatsoever. Yes, the man definitely needed a haircut. You've also got abolitionists like William Seward, who absolutely does not want to compromise over the issue of slavery, finds it so abhorrent. And then you've got, President Taylor, who unfortunately for him dies, and that brings in Fillmore in to the presidency. And so he agrees to that compromise. And of course, I love this image. Henry Clay, yes, I did actually Photoshop that myself. Let me move my face out of here a little bit so you can read what Fillmore said. But yes, he says he comes in and swoops the day. But, this compromise, much like the other compromises, are really just going to be a Band-Aid on the issue of slavery that will come about. So back over here. Let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so this is what the map looks like now after the Compromise of 1850. So you can take a look. This is the territory here. I'm talking about the Mexican Cession Territory. Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is the 3630 line. Anything above it is supposed to be free. Anything below it is supposed to be slave state. We're going to see how that changes here in just a moment. But you can see that that this will fulfill the idea of manifest destiny too, by the way, all the way to the coast. And these territories, not yet fully occupied yet, that's why they're unorganized territories at the time. All right, so I told you I talked to you guys here about the fugitive slave law. So there is a really good clip that I recommend that you listen to about the fugitive slave law that I'll put here also. But essentially what it is allowed special federal commissions to determine the fate of these fugitives without a jury trial, without real evidence or testimony. Citizens had to aid. They were like almost forcefully deputized to aid in the capture of these fugitives. And these laws don't just affect the slave state, they affect the free state. Now, there was a fugitive slave law actually in the Constitution, but it didn't have much teeth, and they really weren't doing much to do that, okay? Now, this is going to obviously cause a problem with the Underground Railroad. It's actually going to reroute to Canada because even in the northern states, it becomes pretty dangerous. The Republican Party, for the very first time, really rises to power. Now, I want to stop for just a moment and just remind you that this Republican Party, although it is the same Republican Party that exists today, their platforms are going to change over time. Same thing with the Democratic Party, so try not to get those confused and put your 21st century head on that. As time moves on, as American history changes, so do the platforms on these different political parties. Now, the Republican Party was comprised of anti-slavery Democrats, Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, even people in the Know-Nothing Party. They were very focused on the expansion of the railroad and things like this. And something very important to point out, I'm going to move my little head here for this so that you can see this. They're not abolitionists, okay? So abolitionists at this time, they're a fringe group. They're kind of the crazy people, and not many people were full abolitionists for the full freedom, economic equality, political equality of blacks, okay? They wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. They don't want to, and they don't think they have the authority, much like the Free Soilers did, not think they did, in the Constitution itself. Okay. So the next thing that comes about is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, this territory here is the Kansas Territory. It's the one that's going to next petition for statehood. And remember that popular sovereignty was only in these two territories. This was supposed to technically fall under the 3630 line, okay? So Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This overturns the Missouri Compromise. The anti-slavery Democrats are extremely upset, and this essentially splits the Democratic Party. The people in the South, staunchly Democrats, believing that this was right, but the Northern Whigs and some Democrats, they conglomerate into this new Republican Party because of this issue itself. Now, this is going to lead to what we call like the Kansas Civil War. Okay, so just like I talked to you about before, this idea of popular sovereignty might seem like a good idea on the outside, but essentially what happened is that pro-slavery people in the South send people when the vote comes up for Kansas. Pro-slavery people from the North pour into Kansas, or anti-slavery people from the North, I'm sorry, pour into Kansas. They form their own towns. Hundreds and hundreds of pro-slavery people flood into this, and anti-slavery people flood in. This sets up huge rivalry, and essentially a huge civil war breaks out. Okay, this is called and deemed Bleeding Kansas. This idea that Stephen Douglas had to come up with this idea of popular sovereignty is generally discredited over this issue. It causes a huge issue in Congress. I'm going to show you a political cartoon here in a minute. I also recommend you watch a video clip underneath here about Bleeding Kansas. It's very good and really explains quite a bit. So this political cartoon, very famous political cartoon, obviously pro-North, pro-abolitionist, right? So this image is Preston Brooks. This is a fight that broke out in Congress over this whole issue of slavery and of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You can't really read it very well on here, but it says the crime against Kansas. This person on the ground that's getting beaten is Preston Brooks, and Charles Sumner, who is an abolitionist and from the North, and essentially blamed the South for the chaos in Kansas, and he reads this very contentious speech called The Crime Against Kansas. So, taking offense to this, Preston Brooks goes to Charles Sumner, literally beats the crap out of him with his cane, and he breaks his cane over his head. He is celebrated. Both parties are both groups are celebrated. Sumner's actually seriously injured and doesn't come back to Congress for quite a while, for a couple years. And Preston Brooks is honored in the South. He eventually does have to step down from the Congress for a while. He ends up coming back, dying a year later, actually. But he's celebrated. Not only that, people in the South send him canes, some of them golden canes, congratulating on breaking a cane over an abolitionist's head. So if this tells you anything, this should tell you how contentious the issue of slavery was here in the expansion of it. Okay? All right, moving on here a little bit. So the next election is the first time that the Republicans push forward a candidate, and the candidate was Fremont. You can see that it starts to become much more sectionalized than it was before. Now, Republicans don't win, but this was a pretty impressive show for the first time a political party pushed forward a candidate. Okay, so Buchanan is going to become the president. He's actually looked at as one of the worst presidents in American history, mainly because he really did nothing to really stave off the coming Civil War. The next big thing that happens is the Dred Scott decision. So this was a case, and there's another video too that I recommend on this one because this is a big issue. A Dred Scott case, basically he was a slave from Missouri that had moved to Illinois with his owner. He sued for his freedom because Illinois was a free state, but Justice Roger Taney said that only in this case, not only did he say that he couldn't have his freedom, but he said that black people could not inherently, anybody of African descent could not inherently be citizens at all. And he threw out the Missouri Compromise, saying Congress had no authority to relegate anything or to say whether or not somebody could bring slaves to states, essentially saying that they were property. This causes an enormous uproar, but ironically Frederick Douglass says that this is the best thing that could have happened to the abolition movement, and he says this because it forces people to really choose a side. At this point, Frederick Douglass was really thinking that there really was no other alternative than civil war, which is eventually what it leads to. So a young congressman, and he runs for Senate, a man named Abe Lincoln here on the left, and Stephen Douglas, his opponent in Illinois, run for a contentious senatorial race in 1858. Douglas was the one that came up with the idea of popular sovereignty, and the idea that was discredited after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and in the very famous campaigns over whether or not slavery and non-slavery could coexist. And this is, of course, where he makes his very famous House Divided speech. A house divided cannot stand itself. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. So again, Lincoln is not proposing to get rid of slavery. He was a Republican, a free soiler, really thinking that it's to stop the expansion of slavery. Okay, he loses, but his speeches in these debates garner a lot of Republican support and is really the reason behind why the Republicans push him to run for the president in the next term. The next case, next big event, and by the way, I'm doing this chronologically, was John Brown's raid in 1859. He was involved in Bleeding Kansas, a horrible massacre by him and his sons, actually, against pro-slavery people during Bleeding Kansas. But he was a Calvinist. He believed that he was destined to launch a slave rebellion to overthrow this horror of slavery. And on October 16th of 1859, he and his followers go to an arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, to get weapons to arm slaves, because at that point, not only was it illegal for slaves to read and write, it was also illegal for them to own weapons. He intended to give those guns to slaves and to, launch a rebellion. He's met by federal forces. There's a shootout. He is caught. He is eventually hanged, for his crime. Makes very impressive speech at the time. I will say, though, that abolitionists at this time, they do not condone what he's done. Most abolitionists like Garrison and even Douglas, who had become more militant by this point, even he is shrugging his shoulders at this. But he does become a martyr to a lot of people in the South, and in the North, and demonized completely in the South. But this is shows you that tensions were extremely, were building up and building up. So the election of 1860, Republican platform, essentially stated this, and now Lincoln is going to be their candidate. Dred Scott decision is invalid. They oppose the expansion of slavery. They are very focused on economic plans, homesteads, protective tariff, and building and completing a transcontinental railroad across the United States. Now Lincoln will win this on this whole free soil idea platform that has become part of the Republican Party without a single Southern vote. Not long after that, about a week, South Carolina formally secedes from the Union. And you can see this is now completely sectionalized. You can see how the map, so he carries the vote, and this shows you the popular vote versus electoral vote. There were 4 candidates, so that's why you don't see majority there. But he does win the presidency, and this is what ultimately leads to the Civil War. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Please do watch all those videos. That will help you very much. And make sure you keep track, bookmark this video, because it will help you greatly with your final essay. Have a great week.